Welcome back to PSC's Tech Byte. This is the final episode of the series about how to consume micrograph from an iOS application. And today I want to explain you how you can use the Microsoft Graph Sdk for iOS in order to improve your code quality and to speed up the development process. In fact, with Cocoa Pods, you can also add to your iOS solutions built with Swift in Xcode not only the MSAL library like we did in the previous episodes, but also the Ms Graph Client SDK and the Ms Graph Client models in order to have the fully typed definition of all of the entities that you can manage through the Microsoft Graph. So, like always, let me move to the demo environment and let me show you how to consume Microsoft Graph via Microsoft Graph SDK for iOS. So, let's start having a look at the application in action. So, I have an iOS app running on the emulator of an iPhone 13. And here I can simply click on the sign in button and I can go through the UI. And again, sorry for the Italian language in the dialogues. I can choose an already authenticated account and I can proceed consuming the Microsoft Graph. Right now I'm just authenticating and I have an access token. I can click on the Call Microsoft Graph API to retrieve the list of events that the current user has in his default calendar. And of course I can eventually sign out and sign in again. So that's the idea of the application that I've built as a demo. Then, if we switch to the code base and to the actual solution, first of all, it is interesting to notice that in the pod file related to the project, we are referencing the MSAL package as well as the Ms Graph Client SDK and the Ms Graph Client models. And by doing that, you will simply need to do a pod install and set up all of the packages in the solution. And as such, in the solution, we can see that under pods, we have all of the three packages that I showed you. Moreover, I created a couple of helper classes. So I have an authentication manager.swift file. In this one, I simply use a set of code provided by Microsoft through the official documentation with a slightly set of changes. So for example, right here in the init method of the authentication manager type, which is provided as a singleton, as you can see here I have an instance property which will be an instance of the actual authentication manager type. In the init, I will simply read from a .plist file that I have in my project, and in the .plist file I have the tenant ID, the application ID or the client ID, as well as the permission scopes that I need for my application. I simply read the .plist file right here, and after reading the content, I simply set a few local variables for my authentication manager type, so that I can then create the authority URL, I can create the actual authority URL, I can create the authority object as an MSAL AAD authority, and then using a custom configuration, I can create an instance of the MSL public client application. In this authentication manager type, I also have a getAccessToken method, which will try to get the access token either using the interactive model or the silent model. And at the very end of this class, I will also have a sign out method to sign out from Azure Active Directory. Then I have a Graph Manager class in which I rely on the MS HTTP client type, as well as I create a new instance of that type, providing an instance of the authentication manager, so that I will rely on that authentication manager type to do all the actual implementation of the authentication part of the story. And then I have an helper method getEvents, which will simply provide as a result an array of Ms Graph event types, where this type is defined in the Ms Graph client models, while the client is defined in the Ms Graph Client SDK. So here, in order to consume the Ms Graph through the Ms Graph SDK, I simply need to prepare a request for the events endpoint of the me endpoint in the graph base URL. I will use the MS URL session data task to make the actual request using the graph client that I created before with the factory and providing the details about the request. and when I will get back a data response in case of a successful response, I will simply process data as an MS collection instance, and I will go through the items in the collection to create the actual array of MS Graph events, which I will return as the result of my method. Simple as that. In the view controller Swift, I simply have the initUI method, which will create the 3 buttons to sign in, sign out, and call the Microsoft Graph. And then I will have the init authentication method. In the init authentication method, I try to use the authentication manager to authenticate silently. And if not, I will rely on the sign in button that the user can click, and by clicking on the sign in button, I will get the token interactively, and then I will enqueue in the main thread the request to update the UI and to show that the user has been authenticated and to update the status of the sign in and sign out buttons. Then with the call graph function, which is associated to the corresponding button in the UI of the iOS application, again, I simply rely on the graph manager that we just saw, on the singleton instance, and I do the get events in order to get back the events array. And if I will get the events array, I will simply use them to read the capacity of the array and to show the number of events retrieved from the calendar. And then I have the sign out button, which will again rely on the singleton instance of the authentication manager to sign out the user and to update the UI. So if you think about what we saw in the previous episodes of this series about how to consume graph with iOS, this last solution based on the Graph SDK is really simple and clean compared with the previous one where we had a lot of plumbing in the code base. And at the very end, we simply need to rely on the authentication manager to sign in and sign out, and to the graph manager to do the actual method invocation of the HTTP REST API that we want to consume in Microsoft Graph. And by binding the graph client inside the graph manager to the authentication manager singleton instance, we have a transparent transfer of the access token that we retrieve in the authentication to the graph client of the Microsoft Graph SDK. Like always, thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. And before closing, I would also like to wish you a wonderful new year. Thank you, and remember, subscribe to this channel.